After making his way through the cold waters of Loch Arnish, Chris Murray finds exactly what he is looking for. On this lake on Lewis off the west coast of Scotland, the diver is examining a mysterious man-made island known as a crannog. And, incredibly, the secrets that Murray discovers deep below the water's surface will change everything that experts know about these strange, prehistoric landmasses. Archaeologists have uncovered the ancient secrets of these mysterious Scottish islands. These crannogs, which can be wholly or partially man-made, are found in lochs, rivers and estuaries. And for many years, it's been believed that these mysterious entities date back to the Iron Age, so, about 2,800 years from the present day. This school of thought claims that ancient people constructed the crannogs with either stone, timber or a combination of the two. Humans are then thought to have erected buildings on the artificial islands, again using wood or stone. And, altogether, Scotland has some 570 crannogs, which are sometimes also known as island duns. Around 170 of these Scottish examples are located on the islands of the Outer Hebrides, including Lewis. Ireland, too, has roughly 2,000 crannogs, while just one is to be found in Wales, the third Celtic part of Britain. As far as the Scottish crannogs are concerned, meanwhile, historians have previously believed that they were used from around 800 BC right up until around 1700 AD. However, as we'll see, it's that earlier date that has been challenged, all because of the extraordinary artifacts Murray found at the bottom of Loch Arnish. But before we discover exactly what the diver managed to unearth, let's investigate crannogs themselves. Generally speaking, archaeologists use the term crannog to describe the small man-made islands that can be found in both Ireland and Scotland. Yet that doesn't mean all crannogs are from the same era or culture, nor do they all look identical. Some crannogs, for instance, are built entirely from timber. In those cases, ancient people constructed wooden buildings atop piles driven into the bed of a loch. And examples of these crannogs can be found at Loch Tay, which is almost 15 miles long and set within the majestic Central Highlands countryside. In fact, Loch Tay boasts in excess of 20 crannogs, all of which are thought to date back to the Iron Age, although the timber remains of those islands now lie beneath the water. These particular wood-built crannogs featured roundhouses with thatched roofing that were supported on a series of timber piles. The roundhouses made for easily defensible dwellings, too, as the loch itself acted as a natural moat. In 1980, however, archaeologists began working to discover the crannogs of Loch Tay. Fortunately, they found one such example at a place on the loch called Oakbank, which is adjacent to the crofters village of Fernan on the loch's northern shore. Crofters, in case you didn't know, are farmers who work small holdings in the highlands. And as it happens, the Oakbank site yielded some extraordinary Iron Age artifacts. You see, the experts didn't just uncover the timbers with which the crannog had been built, but they also turned up clothing and tools from 2,600 years ago. A butter dish was even found that still had traces of the foodstuff encrusted on its surface. And these valuable discoveries would ultimately act as the catalyst for an amazing project that was carried out by some experimental archaeologists in 1994. Experimental archaeologists aim to learn more about ancient peoples by attempting to replicate things that they once did. Sometimes, that even involves reconstructing whole buildings or edifices, and that was certainly the case with the 1994 plan. You see, the specialists decided to create their own Iron Age crannog on Loch Tay near the village of Kenmore. Here, they would build a modern crannog using the same materials and methods that had been used 2,600 years ago. The team from the Scottish Trust for Underwater Archaeology started by sinking 168 wooden piles into the bed of the northeastern tip of the loch. After that, they built a 65-foot-long causeway from the shore to the site of the crannog. Then, on top of the timber piles, the group laid a nearly 50-foot-wide platform on which they would ultimately erect a roundhouse with a thatched roof. However, the key to successfully creating a crannog was, and still is, the right timber. The Iron Age builders may have been knowledgeable foresters, in fact, as they needed to ensure that the correct tree trunks were readily available for their constructions. And the 20th century group also picked carefully, selecting alder trees for their piles. Of course, Iron Age people would have used many types of timber for different purposes, from cooking utensils to structural supports. It seems probable, too, that some of the humans living during that era were highly skilled carpenters who would have had an acute understanding of the different properties of various types of wood. It's also likely that the Iron Age crannogs were attached to farms on the land by a loch's edge. The ancient people would therefore have raised cattle and grown crops in fields on the lake's shores, while sheep grazed on nearby hillsides. Nature would also have provided supplies such as wild fruit and nuts, game that could be hunted, and herbal medicines. Yet the archaeologists who reconstructed the crannog on Loch Tay soon discovered one of the most difficult parts of the process: the positioning and sinking of the piles into the bed of Loch Tay. The piles formed the structure's foundation, too, so they were key to the success of the project. And it didn't help, either, that the builders had to achieve their feat without the benefit of modern technology. But how did Iron Age people manage to pull the process off? Well, in order to begin constructing the crannogs, humans living 2,600 years ago must naturally have used rafts or boats to get out onto the loch. After that, they would have erected some sort of wooden scaffolding so that they could set to work on driving the piles. The ancient Scots would have then transported the trunks of alder trees, which could each have been up to 30 feet long, out onto the water. And since the tree trunks would have floated, builders at the time wouldn't have struggled to get them positioned correctly on the loch. Getting the wood into the correct vertical position to start driving it into the lake's bed would have been a lot trickier, however. Then, finally, when the trunks were right where they needed to be, the resulting pile would have been forced into the loch's bed with the use of a cross pole. The archaeologists reckon that it would have taken 12 days of hard work to get the 168 piles necessary for the structure. These piles would have then been sunk to a depth of around 6 feet, after which the builders would have laid a platform. Then, following that part of the process, the Iron Age people would have started work on constructing a roundhouse. The ancient builders would have fashioned joinery joints attached with pegs and secured with rope lashes to create the platform. Round timber beams were also utilized to make the floor of the house, while the roof would have been constructed from reeds from the loch itself. The walls, meanwhile, were made by weaving together thin sticks that had been cut from hazel trees. And as we've noted, experts formerly believed that the crannogs in Scotland could be dated to around 800 BC and 1980, though, archaeologist Ian Armitt made a discovery on the Outer Hebrides island of North Uist that challenged this assumption. You see, back then, Armitt found that a crannog called Alien Domnul was actually between 5,200 and 4,800 years old. Of course, Armitt gave a much earlier date than experts had previously recognized. And as a result, archaeologists began to wonder if crannogs may actually have been widespread during the Stone Age. Yet for many years, no further evidence was found to support this new idea. Perhaps, then, Alien Domnul was an anomaly. And although no more Stone Age crannogs were discovered after Armitt's find in 1980, it wasn't for the want of searching. You see, specialists attempted to turn up other examples in 1986 and on a further 2 occasions in 2012. During all of these endeavors, though, they ultimately drew a blank. And that brings us back to Chris Murray, the diver who was exploring the waters of Loch Arnish in 2012. What's more, although Murray is not a professional archaeologist, it was his discoveries that changed the accepted dating of crannogs in the Scottish Highlands. Still, while Murray may not be an archaeologist, he is most certainly a colorful character. Born William Ian Murray in London, the diver would go on to be raised in Dornoch in the Scottish Highlands county of Sutherland. Dornoch, which lies on the eastern coast of Scotland, is a pretty coastal town and resort that is known for its sandy beaches. Murray was then educated at Dornoch Academy before joining the Royal Navy, where he served as a diver on special missions to disarm explosives. After that, he worked as a diver in the North Sea oilfields prior to becoming part of the British Coast Guard. And during his 22 years with the Coast Guard, Murray earned a reputation for outstanding bravery. In 2001, for example, Murray took part in the highly perilous rescue of the crew of German fishing boat Hansa. At the time, the vessel was situated some 200 miles from the Outer Hebridean island of Benbecula and was in severe difficulties during a storm. And while, tragically, 6 of the crew would perish, a further 9 ultimately escaped to a life raft. Murray brought all of these 9 crew members safely aboard his helicopter and would go on to win the Queen's Gallantry Medal for his courageous feat. But, now in his 60s, Murray was pursuing the gentler activity of diving around the crannog in Loch Arnish. And what the diver found in the water there would not only surprise him, but also astonish and delight archaeologists. Lying around the underwater edges of the crannog, you see, there was a treasure trove of Stone Age pottery. Specifically, Murray uncovered 2 distinct varieties of ceramics, one known as Hebridean Neolithic and the other as Unstan. Then, after having made his fateful find, the former serviceman teamed up with Mark Elliott, a conservation officer with the Museum Nan Alien in Stornoway, to explore other crannogs on Lewis. And while investigating these sites, which had been identified using Google Earth, Elliott and Murray turned up even more examples of well-preserved Stone Age pottery in the waters around them. It seemed, then, that the Stone Age crannog on North Uist was not unique, and that such structures had indeed been in use around the Outer Hebrides during the Stone Age. Yet Murray and Elliott's findings gave rise to a whole new set of questions. Why were Stone Age people hurling their crockery into the lochs around their crannogs, for example? Well, the University of Reading's Duncan Garrow attempted to clear some of these matters up when he spoke to National Geographic in June 2019. And the interview came just after he and a colleague had published a paper that revealed the truth about the Stone Age crannogs. When talking to the magazine, Garrow, an associate professor of archaeology, called the discovery of these ceramic vessels amazing. He added, "I've never seen anything like it in British archaeology. People seem to have been chucking this stuff in the water. But why on earth would they do that in the first place?" Well, Garrow and his fellow archaeologists said that perhaps the pots were hurled from crannogs into lochs as part of some kind of festival. This celebration may have itself been related to religious rituals or social ceremonies, or perhaps a mix of the two. Since the Stone Age people did not leave written records, however, we may never know for sure. Fellow archaeologist Vicky Cummings, who works at the UK's University of Central Lancashire, also highlighted how baffling this practice of throwing the pots into the lochs was. By way of an example, she pointed out to National Geographic that these particular crannogs seem to be far from any Stone Age villages. The structures are also nowhere near any signs of human burial, which are often connected with ritual ceremonies. This made whatever rites may have been observed at the crannogs all the more mysterious. There's no doubt, either, that Stone Age people in Britain had a habit of building monumental structures from rock. You need look no further than Stonehenge, arguably the most famous British structure of that period, for evidence of this. Even so, these crannogs reveal yet more about Stone Age dwellers' apparent penchant for construction with the material. You see, these Stone Age crannogs were built in a different way to any of the Iron Age examples, such as the one reconstructed by experimental archaeologists at Loch Tay. Yes, while the Iron Age varieties were entirely made of timber, up to and including the piles used to support the roundhouses, their older counterparts on Lewis and North Uist were created using an alternative method. In particular, the Stone Age crannogs utilized massive boulders as foundations rather than wood. It seems, in fact, that their builders hauled rocks weighing up to 550 pounds onto the lochs before dumping them into the water. And maneuvering these huge lumps of stone into position must have taken a substantial amount of extremely hard human labor. Cummings observed to National Geographic, "Who would want to spend all of their time putting stones in a loch? It's a crazy thing to spend your time doing." Nonetheless, the archaeologist went on to speculate about what these ancient Britons may have been doing all those thousands of years ago. Cummings claimed, for instance, that the fact that the sites were distant from everyday human habitation suggests they were used for special celebrations, such as those marking the change from childhood to adult life. She added, "Clearly it was not appropriate to take the pottery, brought to the Neolithic crannogs, home. But just how many of the 570 or so crannogs in Scotland are actually much older than originally thought? Well, the truth is that we don't yet know the answer to that puzzle. Up until now, scientists have only subjected around 20% of the country's crannogs to radiocarbon dating. So can we assume that there may be Stone Age crannogs all over Scotland and maybe even in Ireland? Perhaps, but one expert has sounded a note of caution. Cole Henley, who is a specialist on structures on the Outer Hebrides archipelago from that period, told National Geographic, "Extrapolating is dangerous. It's like trying to do a jigsaw when you've only got 5 pieces and you've lost the box and don't know what the picture looks like." In any case, we can be fairly sure that crannogs were a feature of Stone Age life on the lochs of the Outer Hebrides Islands. And as Garrow actually plans to conduct further research using advanced techniques such as side-scan sonar, perhaps he'll unearth yet more examples from the same era. Given the number of crannogs we already know about, though, the archaeologist and his colleagues will have many years of work ahead of them. But these crannogs are far from the only islands to boast a bizarre backstory, as the Republic of Malta has a strange tale of its own. With an area of just 122 square miles, Malta represents little more than a series of specks upon the Earth. Yet despite its small size, the archipelago actually has an incredibly rich history. And it's a story that stretches back many thousands of years. There's even evidence of ancient peoples having lived on the islands, and we're not just talking about Homo sapiens. Back in 1917, you see, a paleontologist named Giuseppe Despot was conducting works in Malta. And as Despot carried out a dig inside a cave, the expert made a significant discovery: some teeth. But these fossilized chompers hadn't actually belonged to a modern human at all. In fact, they'd come from a species that roamed the Earth some 40,000 years ago. And a similar find from J.G. Baldacchino in 1936 was further confirmation of Malta's compelling past. Yes, Baldacchino discovered another tooth that appeared to have come from the same species as the one suggested by Despot's find. You might expect, then, that more efforts were subsequently made to pore through Malta's astonishing history. But that's not quite what happened. Archaeological investigations of Malta are said to have been shelved with the onset of World War II in 1939. This is hardly surprising, of course, given the vital part that the tiny country played throughout the conflict. because although Malta was then part of the British Empire, it was located near to the Axis power of Italy. The islands were therefore forced to endure many hardships. Even after the war ended, however, the true tale of Malta's long and rich history remained generally untold. That's according to Leni Riedisch, a Dutch expert who's written a number of books on the area's past. Interestingly, too, Riedisch has implied that a downright inaccurate account of the island's past has been propagated instead. What is this falsehood? Well, for context, it's worth understanding a bit more about Malta and its past. The Republic of Malta lies in the south of Europe, within the Mediterranean Sea, situated close to Italy, Libya, and Tunisia. Today, it's considered to be one of the 10 smallest countries on Earth, but it nonetheless holds close to 500,000 inhabitants. So the nation has an extremely concentrated population that's among the most dense anywhere in the world. Malta's positioning between Europe and Africa has also seen it fall under the influence of various civilizations over the centuries. At one point or another, for instance, Malta has been controlled by the Romans, Greeks, Arabs, French and Brits, to name but a few. These days, though, Malta is an independent nation within the European Union. When Malta was under the control of Britain in the 1930s, however, it had apparently been celebrated by historians around the globe who'd appreciated its archaeological wonders. After all, the area is home not only to centuries-old remains but also to age-old temples. When World War II reached the islands, though, the historical significance of the region was largely pushed aside. Malta was dragged into the conflict very abruptly, in fact. And within hours of Italian dictator Benito Mussolini making it known that his country was at war with Britain and France, his forces bombed the Maltese capital of Valletta. The country ultimately ended up suffering through some of the worst aerial assaults in the whole conflict as well. There was a particular reason why Malta was targeted so ruthlessly by Italian, and also German, aircraft. You see, the archipelago's position in the Mediterranean made it crucial to Allied offensives in nearby North Africa. And it was also clear that Malta could be used for a future offensive against the heartland of Italy. By the time the war concluded, then, the islands of Malta were essentially left in ruins. Many military personnel and civilians had been killed there, in fact, and a huge number of buildings had also been impaired or totally demolished. And its economy took decades to recover from the ravages of the conflict, too. But the inhabitants of Malta were nonetheless recognized for their inspiring courage during the Siege of Malta. Yes, after enduring the most intense, lasting bombardment of the conflict, more than 150 full days and nights of bombing, the people of the islands were given an award. The entire Maltese populace in fact received the George Cross, the uppermost civilian accolade bestowed by Britain. Of course, all of this chaos and destruction ensured that archaeological investigation on Malta wasn't exactly a priority. But things apparently didn't improve all that much after the war had come to a close, either. The aforementioned Leni Riedisch has even claimed that an inaccurate story of Malta's prehistory was spread at the expense of the truth. Riedisch believes that this false narrative came about because some historians removed mention of humans having inhabited the islands during the last ice age, a period beginning around 2.5 million years in the past and ending a little less than 12,000 years ago. So instead, Riedisch said, an alternative account in which Neolithic people settled on Malta about 7,000 years ago was put forward. In her 2018 book, Sirius, the Star of the Maltese Temple, Riedisch pondered how such a story could have been so widely popularized. How it has been possible that this version of history has been accepted in Malta for so long is, seen in retrospect, a mystery, she wrote. Nor is it easy to understand why any broader view, no matter how carefully researched, has been received with such implacable resistance ever since. One possible explanation may have its roots in politics. You see, one of the most significant archaeologists ever to work in Malta before World War II was Luigi Maria Ugolini. A native of Italy, Ugolini and his investigations were essential in painting a picture of Malta's distant past. The man was, however, a fascist. In 1924, in fact, Ugolini joined up with the Italian Fascist Party. And his work in Malta throughout 1931 was explicitly financed by the Italian state, which was then led by Mussolini. So even though Ugolini's studies were particularly important, they were seemingly largely forgotten after the war came to an end. Ugolini passed away in 1936 while still in his early 40s. Yet despite his premature death, he left behind an immense body of information regarding Malta's past. These records were left in Rome's Luigi Pigorini National Museum of Prehistory and Ethnography. And, perhaps owing to the man's links to fascism, they remained there until their rediscovery in the year 2000. So, according to Riedisch, there's evidence of human presence on Malta that dates back further than the dates that have been widely accepted in the second half of the 20th century. Riedijk also points towards skeletons discovered in Malta as representing direct proof of this. And she further mentioned, in her book, that a number of items used by humans had been found on the islands. Less explicit clues indicating an early human presence on the Maltese islands apparently also include the remains of animals that had been left in piles. Some of these bones, Riedijk states, were discovered in places where the creatures themselves wouldn't typically have been seen. So this would suggest that people were hunting and later consuming them. According to Riedijk, discoveries such as these were made at a time when archaeological investigation was still valued in Malta. Yet it might also be said that animal remains and smaller artifacts are somewhat modest discoveries. Especially when one considers some of the prehistoric artworks and ancient temples located throughout the islands. For example, Riedijk has written about paintings that adorn the walls of a Maltese cave system. Known as Gur Hassan, this network is found in the southern portion of the main island. It has a sizable entryway that faces out to the Mediterranean Sea. And if you were to go inside Gur Hassan, you'd find yourself having to pass through a tunnel. And while this seemingly starts out as being quite roomy, the tunnel becomes increasingly tight the deeper inside you go. A number of other tunnels will also present themselves, but the majority of these lead to nowhere. If you manage to weave through the maze of tunnels, then, you eventually come to an opening. Defined by a long bench that has been carved into the rock, this room had clearly been created by human beings. And as Riedijk writes, there are tales that it once housed a runaway Muslim slave. Elsewhere within Gur Hassan, paintings have been discovered upon the walls. These were found by a celebrated specialist in rock art named Professor Emmanuel Anati, who came across them during the 1980s. The artworks were said to be quite difficult to see, but they were nonetheless intriguing, and included handprints as well as some depictions of animals. Photographs were subsequently taken of the works, with Anati later giving them to Valletta's Archaeological Museum. And he also recorded his thoughts on the paintings. Many of the images are not very clear, he wrote, according to the Ancient Origins website. However, it was possible to establish that stylistic, associative, graphic and conceptual models reflect a layer dating to the Hunters period, before the Neolithic, never before reported in Malta. Sadly, though, at some point towards the end of the 20th century, the cave artworks were apparently lost. The passage of time, it seems, had managed to wipe away the prehistoric sketches. The photographs of the works that were taken of the paintings in the 1980s now represent the only known evidence of their presence. This isn't the only example of age-old art having disappeared within Malta in recent times, either. A further instance relates to a painting of a bull that had been found inside an ancient Maltese temple. Known as the Hypogeum of Halsaflieni, this place of worship had been constructed beneath the earth. Fittingly, too, the name of the Hypogeum derives from the Greek word for underground. The structure itself is thought to date back to the Neolithic period, around 5,000 years ago. It's suspected that it used to serve as both a safe haven and somewhere to entomb the dead. Some 7,000 human remains have been found there to date, after all. The Hypogeum was accidentally stumbled upon by laborers in 1902. They'd been busy developing local residences when they ended up cutting through the top of the temple. Apparently, the workers initially sought to conceal the ancient construction, but their efforts ultimately proved unsuccessful. And so the year after its rediscovery, the Hypogeum was properly excavated. These works, however, weren't especially stringent. Many of the items found inside the Hypogeum were subsequently lost. Artifacts and skeletons taken from graves were removed without being appropriately documented, for instance. And when the head of the excavation passed away in 1907, his notes on the works disappeared with him. After that, a man named Sir Themistocles Zamet took over as the leader of excavations inside the Hypogeum. Around this time, too, the temple was made open to the public. In 1910 Zamet started to publish papers about the temple, and many of the artifacts he recovered there were subsequently delivered to Valletta's National Museum of Archaeology. Items retrieved from the Hypogeum during this period included pots, beads and the tops of axes. There were also some carvings in the shape of people and other creatures. On top of this, a clay figurine that's been dubbed the Sleeping Lady was also found. Seeming to depict a goddess, this figure is actually considered by some to be the site's most important artifact. The Hypogeum was also home to other examples of ancient artwork, including a painting that depicted a bull. This was found during the 1950s, though, and a number of photos from that era survive. The bull was then mentioned in a book, written by an archaeologist named David Trump, from the early 1970s. So it seems that the artwork was created with manganese oxide, a substance that's been found in other Stone Age works. In fact, the general manner of the painting suggested that it derived from a date before the Neolithic period. And this was finally confirmed by UNESCO testing towards the end of the 1980s. Sadly, though, the bull painting can no longer be seen inside of the Hypogeum. and Riedijk has claimed that she spoke with a person who'd worked at the site back in the 1990s. This employee allegedly informed her that he'd been tasked with washing the wall where the painting had once been. Riedijk further claimed that mentions of the bull painting have all but vanished from recent publications about Malta's past. Based on her research, in fact, she said its only appearance within a book came in a reissue of one of David Trump's 1970s publications. The researcher also claimed that Trump himself had been questioned about why his own more recent output omitted any allusions to the work. He reportedly responded, "It was very faint." Elsewhere, underwater searches for artifacts and constructions have been taking place in the seas surrounding Malta. These projects, Riedijk explained, have been undertaken by a number of eager, self-funded divers. But despite the lack of external financing that these people receive, some of their investigations have still proven to be fruitful. For instance, a number of trenches have been found on the seafloor near the Maltese coast. Given their precise positioning, these trenches could once have been man-made canals. And based on the evidence, it appears that they were created no less than 8,000 years ago. All in all, then, the islands and waters of Malta are home to a vast array of archaeological treasures. Sadly, though, many investigations of these sites have seemingly been conducted unprofessionally, meaning that much important evidence of the area's past may have been lost. Yet Malta is still a historical marvel. And perhaps it still has more light to shine on what life had been like in prehistoric times.
Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe.